got some quotes that I want to share with you from Jackson's book. I don't know if you can find this anywhere.
Mike?
I had it turned on. It's on. I have it on. Is it working? Can you hear me?
I agree. And I can't hear, so.
Touch it, Tom. See if it's-
I'll move it over. Is that better? I don't know if you can find this book. You can tell that this is a well-worn book, and I'll tell you that it was more or less like this before I ever started teaching this class. It was published by Quality Publications. They didn't do a very good job. It is not high quality binding, but it's one of the best little books on Job that you can find. You might be able to find it on Amazon. I don't know, but if you can get this book,
Who's the author?
Wayne Jackson
Wayne Jackson.
is the author. This was a textbook, one of the textbooks that I had when I was a student in school. He published this around 1983. It's just a very good book. It's concise. It's not obviously a small little workbook. It's designed with questions, so it's designed for like a standard Bible class. But it is really good. When we were together last time, one of the things that we were talking about is Job's request as presented there in chapter 23. This is in response to Eliphaz's final speech, but I wanted to sort of go back there and go quickly from there into Job's final statements that begins in chapter 26 and goes all the way over through chapter 31. And Job is, as I said, he's wanting to present his case before God. And if you keep that in your mind from the standpoint of what he's wanting to do, particularly as when we get over to chapter 26, his final statements. Now, I'll just go ahead and tell you that there are some who suggest that perhaps over in, I believe it's chapter 28 or so, that there's sort of a disconnect. I don't see the disconnect, and some have suggested that the disconnect is because it's probably Zophar did have something to say, but it's never listed as Zophar. I don't believe that there's a disconnect. I don't believe Zophar spoke. I believe that when you start in chapter 26 and you read all the way through to the end of chapter 31, this is entirely Job, and that there is, in my opinion, a tremendous flow of information. And I think, again, the reason I start here in chapter 23, where Job is wanting to make his case, verse 4 of chapter 23, I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. Now, to be fair from the standpoint of when you get into Bildad's response or Bildad's comments there 25, you have to appreciate the argument that he's making there with regards to, in essence, from one standpoint, you cannot be just before God. And that's a true statement. If you just look at me beginning with verse 4 of, verse 4 of 25, how can a man be righteous before God? And we talked about the second part of that with regards to a man that's born of a woman. And he's just not, again, that's not a statement validating original sin. It's a statement that's exalting God above man. And that's the statement that he's putting forth there. And he's correct there. How can a man be righteous before God? And so, how can a man, even a man of the stature of Job, how could such a man want to stand before God and present his case? There's absolutely, there's nothing there that can be done. In fact, what would be our response, or what would be our physical demeanor if God were to present himself right here, right now? We would probably fall on the ground, right? I mean, we would fall. And interestingly, one of the words for worship literally speaks of doing that. And furthermore, if we did say something before God, what would it most likely be? Have mercy on me. That would be the statement that would come from our hearts and from our mouths if God were to present himself here. And so Job here is establishing that he wants to present his case before God, and that if he can make his argument before God, God will see it the way Job is seeing it. And so then I have to say, to Bildad's credit, that statement in verse 4 is really true. How can a man be righteous before God? He can't. He simply can't. And so now, as we move into chapter 26, where Job is now responding firstly to Bildad. But again, it's important to note here that he's responding to all three. He is going to be responding. In fact, if you look at verses 26, 2 through 4, Job answered, said, "How have you helped him who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength? How have you counseled one who has no wisdom? How have you declared sound advice to many, to whom you uttered words, and whose spirit came from you?" Jackson points out that here "you" is both singular in verses 2 through 4, but when you get to verse 5, the dead trembled, those under the waters, in verse 4, the plural form is used. And so both singular and plural "you" is in force. And so he starts with Bildad, but he moves rapidly to all three of them when he is speaking to them. And in essence, what is he saying there? What is he telling them? He's basically saying, your help has been no help at all. And again, that goes back, you remember, he refers to them earlier as miserable comforters. All of them. They've not provided him any help. Furthermore, they have not, and I think this is an important thing because Job is the one that's distraught, okay? Job is the one who is in the throes of a horrible experience that is testing just about every aspect of his life. We've already talked about that. His physical condition, his mental state, you know. Every aspect of his life is being challenged. And sometimes, when we don't have the answers, that obviously someone that is in a state of confusion that's brought on by what they're going through, sometimes the best thing we can do is say, you know what? I don't have the answers. I don't know what to tell you. Okay? And perhaps his friends should have done that. But his friends didn't do that. What his friends did is they argued that, Job, all this is happening to you because you're a bad person. Because you have sinned. But I remind you, what? What does God say about Job? He's upright. You know, in all of his ways. He shuns evil. He's upright and he shuns evil. That's why this is happening. They couldn't see that. They didn't know that. Job didn't understand it like that. And so the help that they obviously, and when was the best help? If you just do a quick reminder here. When did they probably help him the most? When they sat with him for 7 days and didn't say a word, right? That's probably when they helped him most, you know. But when they started talking, when they started their accusations against him, that's when, as Job tells them, you have been no help at all. Now, in verse 20, and we sort of may have touched on this in chapter 27, terror overtakes him like a flood. A tempest steals him away in the night. Again, he's speaking of the tremendous amount of stress and struggle that Job is under. And we have to be impressed again, however, with the fact that while he is in this, while he is going through all this, what does he maintain? He maintains his innocence. He maintains, as it's stated, his integrity. If you look at chapter 27 and verse 5, far be it from me that I should say you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. Wednesday night, we're having our first Wednesday night assembly. We've been meeting on Sunday mornings for the last 4 Sundays, or 5 Sundays. Yesterday was our 5th. But the elders decided that we were going to start meeting on Wednesdays. We're not going to classes. We're just going to have our assemblies, and in essence, we're going to do our own summer series. What I've decided that I'm going to do on Wednesday night is I'm going to talk about the integrity of Job. And I'm going to talk about it from the standpoint of lessons that we can learn about someone who has integrity. And one of the things that I'm going to mention, and I haven't got it all worked out, I worked on it some this afternoon with regards to just making myself some notes, but one of the things that I really want to emphasize is a person of integrity can be wrong, can't they? You know? And he was wrong. He made some errors in statements that he made. You know? Another thing that this is the first thing that comes to mind. A man of integrity is going to be attacked by those who have no integrity. You know? And that's a great lesson that you can get from Job. So, I invite you, as you think about it between now and tomorrow, if you have any ideas with regards to the integrity of Job and some things that you can take away from it, send it to me. I may or may not use it, but I would like to have it. I would like to have it for my own notes because I know it would probably be helpful to me. I've got several more. But man, I mean, here is a man who truly is a man of integrity. And he holds to it, but he doesn't necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because he's a man of integrity that he's right. Chapter 28 really is a discussion on wisdom. And I want to share with you some things that Jackson has to say here. He says, first of all, he says, pure wisdom. Pure wisdom belongs to whom? God. Absolutely. Pure wisdom belongs to God alone, hence can never, ever be attained by man. Now, let's take that appreciation and we have to, again, be somewhat impressed by some of the observation that Job states here. Let's read just a few things beginning with verse 1. Surely there is a mine for silver, and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth, and copper is smelted from the ore. Man puts an end to darkness, and he searches every recess for ore in the darkness and the shadow of death. He breaks open a shaft away from people in places forgotten by feet. They hang far away from man. They swing to and fro. As for the earth, from it comes bread, but underneath it is turned up as by fire. Its stones are the source of sapphires, and it contains gold dust that path no bird knows, nor has the falcon's eye seen it. The proud lions have not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over it. He puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountain at the roots. He cuts out channels in the rocks, and his eye sees every precious thing. He dams up the streams from trickling. What is hidden, he brings forth the light. But where can wisdom be found? You know what? In essence, you know how we might say this? You know how we might word this today? We might word this today as we can send men into outer space. That we can build skyscrapers and buildings that go up, and we can do this and we can do that. We can even build bombs that we can strategically place upon a target that's thousands of miles away from the origin of the rocket that carries the bomb. We can do things like this. But can our wisdom, can our knowledge match that of God's? That's where he's coming from here. Look what he says. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. By Job's day, they were able to do mining and bringing together these precious stones and ore and whatnot. They could do that. And just think of what we can do. I tell you what's really, and I guess every generation does this. Just think of the things that man can do now in your lifetime that they couldn't do when you were born. And yet still, our wisdom and our knowledge and our understanding does not match that of God. And that really is the strength of what he's establishing there. I want to go back to what Jackson has to say here with regards to this. I'm just going to read this this final paragraph on this thought here. Wisdom is not found in the earth or in the sea. It cannot be traded for nor bought with precious ores, for the price of every person is responsible for his own conduct, he says. Human sinfulness commences in that period of one's life that is called youth. A child must reach a certain level of maturity before he is able to choose between evil and good. The qualities of little children are set forth as a model for those who would aspire to enter the kingdom and for those already in the church. The human spirit is not inherited from one's parents. Rather, it is given by God. Hence, at birth, it must be as pure as the source from which it comes. Clearly, babies are not born in sin. And he's sort of connecting that with what we've already talked about. But here's the idea. Here's the idea. From the standpoint of our knowledge of God. The wise man Solomon, which I consider to be the key verse of the entire Proverbs, is verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That's where it begins. And again, this takes us back to the statement with regards to Job. Because what did we say Job wants to do? Job wants to present his case to God, doesn't he? Job wants to show God that, God, I don't deserve what's happening to me. What you're doing is not right. Okay? So he's wanting to make his case to God. All right? And yet, what we've already acknowledged, and what we're going to see as we get to the end of the book, when God does appear to Job, and God does ask Job a series of questions, instead of allowing Job to ask the questions, he said, I'm going to ask you some questions. What is he asking him questions for? What's the purpose? Go ahead. And what's the purpose of all of those questions that God is going to be throwing out at Job beginning in chapter 38? To let Job know what? You don't know nothing. You know what? You really don't know him. And you know what? Job is going to learn that. And you know why Job is going to learn that? I believe that Job is going to learn that because he does fear God. He does reverence God. He has a tremendous awe for God. He's not going to curse him. He's not going to renounce him. He holds to his integrity, but he also maintains his belief in God. Remember, chapter 19, verse 25, what does it say? I know that my Redeemer lives. Even in the midst of some of the foolish things that he does observe, he does acknowledge that his Redeemer lives. I'm convinced that, again, that's the kind of patience that that James is talking about there. The persevering kind. And that's another thing that I'm going to bring up. A man or woman of integrity has patience. And that patience is highlighted by that perseverance, by that determination. And Job maintains that. And so when God does confront Job, it's not Job who's asking the questions. It's God that's asking Job the questions. And Job in the end is going to say, I'm the one who misspoke. I'm the one who shouldn't have been opening his mouth. You know? And so wisdom is the beginning of knowledge. And here Job is saying this, and you read through this, you want to read through this carefully, and I probably jumped into that part and then back up to some of the things that Jackson said. But the point with regards to children, certainly there's no sin that's associated with innocence, as Jackson is putting forth, as we've already talked about. But how are children to learn reverence for God? If that's the beginning of knowledge, that's the beginning of understanding. That's where wisdom begins to take root. We cannot have and know the wisdom of God. God has all wisdom. But we can learn from wise counsel. We can learn from valuable information. I made a mention of my young friend Joseph last week. But here's the thing. We have the benefit of Job. You know, we have the insights of human suffering that's detailed for us here in this magnificent, inspired book. And so we have the opportunity to learn something not only about human suffering, but our relationship with God as we endure whatever suffering we have to go through. And I'm a big believer, and then we'll move quickly because we're going to have to move quickly. I'm a big believer in this fact that the world is made up of people who either, we say this in cliched terms sometimes, the world is made up of people who, when they go through something, they go through the experience and they walk away from it either having learned from it or they are more bitter for it. And I've never really, in my life, and if you've ever had the experience, I'd love to hear it, but I've never heard anyone who has learned from their experiences who's ever bitter about those experiences. You see what I'm saying? And I'm not saying bitter in the sense of that they look back on it fondly, or they have warm memories about it. It may have been a bitter thing that they went through, but what they did not allow the bitter thing that they went through to cause them to be a bitter person. That they learned from it. And from learning from the experience that they have grown and they're better for it. That's, to me, that's the contrast. And that's what we see in Job. That's one of the great things that we can learn from Job. Is that he grew from the experience. And I think that is such an important lesson. As chapter 29, 30, and 31, basically Job is giving a summary. He's given a summary of things, and he starts out by saying that he wishes for the good old days, you might say. Oh, that I were as in months past. Verse 2. As in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness, just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent. Won't for the good old days. And again, it's an understandable, and that is a common human response to hardship. I've seen a bunch of those memes. I finally have gotten that word in my head now. I could never remember what it was, and I'm trying to. I've asked several people to tell me what is the origin of that. But I've seen a couple that I saw one I really liked was based upon the movie Back to the Future. Have any of you seen this one? It says, whatever you do, don't go to 2020. You know. Boy, don't we long for the days. You know, don't we wish that we could go back to the time where we weren't wearing masks? You know, we could shake hands and we could hug. And so whenever we're in a situation, it's commonplace for us to want for the days when it was not like that. You know, I remember when I was growing up, working, and growing up on a farm and having to get up at 4 o'clock every morning and go to the dairy and was doing all of that and I was hating it, and I said, boy, I can't wait to get to be 18, to get out of here and to be on my own. And when I got to be 18, 19, 20, and I was on my own, I actually thought, boy, it wouldn't be too bad to get up this morning and have to go to the dairy and know when I got finished milking that I'd be going back to a hot breakfast. You know, those were the good old days. You know, and what do we do? What do we do when we go to reunions? We talk about those days then that we hated back then, but boy, we look at them and they're the good old days. So there's a different perspective. Well, Job here finds himself wishing for the good old days. Verse 7, when I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square, the young men saw me and hid, and the aged ones arose and stood. Yeah, those were the good old days for Job. He remembers that, and he wants that. Now, turn to chapter 30. He starts chapter 30 by saying, but now they mock me. Young men younger than I, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock. They mock me. This is my present reality. Once I was esteemed and now I'm not. That's the situation that Job finds himself in. So he goes from the good old days to the mistreatment that he experiences. In chapter 31, this man again, he claims his innocence. I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon young women? For what is the allotment of God from above and the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked and the disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and count all of my steps? If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceive, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. There you are again. If my step has turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, then let me sow and another eat. Yes, let my harvest be rooted out. I'm innocent. He's saying it over and over and over. I'm innocent. I'm innocent. I've not done anything to deserve this. In chapter 32, we're introduced to a new person in this story. A very important person. Jackson says that the position of Elihu is clearly closer to the truth than that of the ash heap philosophers. Speaking of Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz. And I think he's right. Now, that's not to say that Elihu gets everything right. But at least he is closer to the fact than the others. And Jackson gives, he quotes another writer by the name of Roy Zuck. And again, I like, Jackson says that Zuck summarizes the contrast between Elihu's faulting of Job and of the other critics. And what he does is he gives an outstanding summary of what we've looked at thus far. And so I'm going to read in its entirety Zuck's quote in Jackson's beginning of this chapter. Whereas Elihu's 3 elders had recommended that Job repent of willful sin committed prior to his calamity, Elihu recommended that Job repent of pride that developed because of his suffering, and that Job exalt God's work, consider his works, and fear him. The 3 counselors had claimed, now listen to this because this is the key. The 3 counselors had claimed that Job was suffering because he was sinning. But Elihu explained that he was sinning because he was suffering. His suffering led to an attitude of pride before God and a questioning of God's ways. The triad diagnosis pertained to sinful action in Job's past experience, whereas Elihu's diagnosis dealt with sinful attitudes in Job's present life. Now, what I just said earlier with regards to learning something from the experience or being bitter because of the experience. Right? Prior to this speech and prior to God's God's questioning Job. Job was on course of a life of bitterness, wasn't he? I mean, the things that he says, everything that he says, he is bitter. He says, "My complaint is bitter." And so he was on course for a life of bitterness. You know what's interesting? Is 2 of Job's friends, Eliphaz and Bildad, spoke 3 times. And Job responded to them how many times? 3 times. Zophar spoke twice, and Job responded to them how many times? Job doesn't respond to Elihu. Now, again, I mean, you're reading through this, so you got Elihu starts speaking in chapter 32, and he finishes his speech in chapter 37. And the next person to speak in chapter 38 is God. I believe that's significant. Furthermore, I'll tell you this. We've already said that Jackson contends that Elihu is closer to the truth. Doesn't mean that everything he says is absolutely correct. But when you go and read the final chapter here, what was required of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, if you've already read ahead? They had to offer sacrifices. Did Elihu have to offer sacrifices? There's something to Elihu's speech. And I think Elihu's speech humbles Job. But I think obviously it's God's questioning that begins in chapter 38 that is literally going to awaken Job to the reality that he had been wrong. And he learned something. He has learned something. And so the learning curve begins with Elihu. It accelerates in God's questions. And Job is the beneficiary of the wisdom that he got. Now, that's interesting. And Elihu is sort of going to touch upon that. If you look at verse 6, as he begins his speech, he says, I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore, I was afraid and dared not declare my opinions to you. And I said, age should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. Great men, now that word great there is really speaking about their age. Okay? And so, great men are not always wise. Boy, if there was ever a truer statement, you know. And I'll say it like this. When I taught school, I taught public school for several years. I taught 3 years in a private Christian school. And you know what? I learned a lot from my students. When I was in the old Chattanooga City School System. You remember that. I worked with a very special population in that school system. Had students from all over the county that would come, or to the city, all over the city that would come to my program. And they were from some of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. And I learned from them. And I learned things from my students at the Christian school. I learned from them. And sometimes I learned things from them just by some observations that they made. And so young people can teach us older people something. And on the opposite end of it, I've known some old men who didn't live their lives or speak or carry around like they had an ounce of knowledge in their brains, you know. And you know people like that too. So Elihu's making an observation. Out of respect, I've remained quiet, and I've allowed you to speak. But you know, it's not always reserved. Wisdom. It's not only found in older men, and in fact, he's going to make it clear here at verse 10. Therefore, I say, listen to me. I also will declare my opinion. Indeed, I have waited for your words. I've listened to your reasons while you searched out what to say. I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job or answered his words. Not one of you. What he spends in this chapter is basically he's speaking to the freelancer. But then he gets to chapter 33 and he's speaking to Job, and this is where we're going to end. We'll pick up and finish this out next week. He says, but please, Job, hear my speech and listen to all my words. Now, I open my mouth, my tongue speaks in my mouth, and my words come from my upright heart. Wait a minute. We've heard that word upright before, haven't we? That's what God said of Job. Elihu is declaring, I don't have anything in my heart against you. My heart is upright, and the words I'm using here come from that heart. My lips utter pure knowledge. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. You remember Eliphaz's first speech? His first argument was, I got a vision from God. The only thing Elihu here is saying is that the Spirit of God has made me, and He's given me life. If you can answer me, set your words in order before me. Take your stand. Truly, I am as you're spoken before God. I also have been formed out of clay. I'm a man just like you. Surely no fear of me will terrify you. Look what down, drop down to verse 8. Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words, saying, I am pure without transgression. He's summarizing Job. I am innocent, and there is no iniquity in me. Yet he finds occasions against me. He counts me as an enemy. He is speaking of, he is God there. Elihu is saying, he, God, counts, he's paraphrasing Job. Look, in this you are not righteous. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Job, you are not righteous. Now, if we go back to chapter 32 and look at verse 1, when we're introduced to Elihu. So these three men ceased answering Job because Job was what? Righteous in his own eyes. Now remember, who wrote this book? Who does your teacher say wrote this book? Job wrote it. And Job is writing this summary here. And if Job is the writer of this summary, what is Job saying? I was righteous in my own eyes. And boy, if there's ever a lesson we need to learn, we need to learn how easy it is to become self-righteous. And to guard ourselves from it. If you are taking it for credit and you didn't get the take-home test, I've got it here. I'm going to get it to you tonight. I don't have the test answers. Don't worry about it. I'll get it to you. I've had computer problems. I've had Wi-Fi problems since last week. And you know what? They continue. So I'm hoping we'll get that sorted out, both at home and in the church.
So